Hey guys, hey, it's Matthew, and we're coming up on the end of the semester for Web Design 1, and your final project is to create a sketch for a personal website. And more than likely, you'll be taking that sketch as you move forward with Web Design 2. And in this particular circumstance, that class is actually starting a little under a week from today, next Monday. So getting this right in the way that you want it is really, really important. It's also really important that you kind of break through this wall so that you're comfortable with this, I guess, stage of web design as we move forward into web design 2. You don't want to lag behind with this step. You don't want to feel uncomfortable or not quite confident with this business. So I'm really encouraging you all to really kind of break through that wall very, very firmly. It's pretty simple. It's a little bit new, but it's very simple, and I think that you're going to do just fine. So in previous projects, you were basically duplicating project folders and then kind of adding in a cumulative way to your CV or resume. But with this project, you're going to be starting new. You need to start a new project 8 folder, and you need to create an index.html file and a corresponding styles.css file. And then you need to confirm that those two documents are in dialogue and speaking to each other, because you are going to be adding structure to the index.html file and aesthetics to the styles.css file um, as you move forward again. Um, the requirements are pretty simple. A typical website, we're not reinventing the wheel, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want a website to have a header portion, and within that header portion, we want there to be a logo and the menu. And below the header, we want there to be a section to have a banner, which will eventually hold an image. And below that div, the banner div, we would like to have an area for general content. And so within that content div, we are going to have a content box that is going to float right, and a content box that will float left. And then below that content div, we want to have a footer. And within that footer, we'd like to have some social media icons. And we would also like to have an opportunity to have secondary menu items. So maybe a reiteration of a popular menu, regular menu item, or maybe something additional or different. So it's a secondary menu. And we're essentially creating a wireframe for your personal website. And the goal of offering a web program or the web courses for art and design students, designers might find themselves making websites for other folks or working in a marketing graphic design office. And so you're actually going to be doing this on a daily basis as your career. By the way, if you're a designer and you're pretty well versed in coding and doing this type of design work, you're probably going to get an extra bump in your paycheck, because this is technical expertise and not everyone enjoys doing this. I happen to have enjoyed it when I was working as a designer. I frankly, I enjoyed having the extra money too. Um, but in any case, it's a marketable skill that you can apply to your career. If you're an artist, if you're a visual artist, you can still make money and design websites and do things for other folks, but primarily you're focused on trying to give yourself a visual web presence for marketing your own work and your own practice and your own visual arts career. And so kind of keep that in mind when you're thinking about the dimensions or of how you're kind of setting up these ducks for your future website that you're going to be building in web design too. Again, to reiterate, here is the list of divs or boxes that I would say are pretty basic and you really kind of need to get started. The dimensions might be a little bit different. So for example, some folks might have a wider header or a narrow header at the top of their web page. So you can make all those design decisions when you're styling your divs or boxes. By the way, no content will be involved with completing Project 8. So you don't need to worry about paragraph text. You don't need to worry about H1s or H2s or H3s or images or links or menus or any of that stuff. We're not concerned with that right now. The only thing that we're concerned about right now at this point or at this stage in the game is a wire framework, a layout for your future website. And that would include, generally speaking, a lot of these divs or boxes. And I feel like I used my words pretty well here. So no text, images, or info are required to complete this project. Only diagrammatic divs that are placed and arranged strategically. So the first place to start is with a sketch. You can do this on a computer or with software if you have access to that. I happen to have Adobe Illustrator available to me. It's okay if you don't have that and you don't need it, okay? But if you're a design major, you definitely need Adobe Illustrator. But if you're a visual artist or if you're a painter or if you're a photographer, you may not be interested in using Adobe Illustrator. That's fine. But what you can do is you can find yourself some lined or grid paper, and you can use that in a similar way that I'm going to be using Adobe Illustrator. And you can kind of see, I can toggle the grid on and off with this document, but it's really helpful because it's showing me these little incremental dimensions that in this particular circumstance, if I'm not mistaken, each one of these little boxes is 16 pixels. And that's good. I'll tell you why. So if we go back to our PDF on line 14, it says use of pixel dimensions is part of this project. And you'll see I'm using an incremental kind of pattern here, 1024, 512, 256, 128, etc. would mean 64. Divide that by 2 and it's 32. Divide 32 by 2 is 16. Divide 16 by 2 and 8, and so on and so on and so on. Essentially, these are just magic numbers in the web world, and you should be using them to format, to sketch, to do a simple pixel-based layout. That's where Adobe Illustrator can be really valuable, or grid paper. You might have to use your grid paper to scale. So I'll just let you work that out on your own. But it is good to have some kind of a design system so that you can transpose your sketch into code. And so that code can be rendered within your web browser. So what I've done to kind of get us started, first I want to go back and look at our PDF again. This is sort of our roadmap. You need to have a .main container. This could be called anything. It's basically your grandfather container. It's your main container or div that will be holding all of this other stuff. But this is your primary container. You can center it with this margin 0 auto. If you need to, you can find that command anywhere online. Just kind of type it in for centering content with HTML. But in this particular circumstance, I am going to be using class selectors, all right? In the student example that I'll be showing you, he actually used ID selectors, not class selectors. I just happen to use classes more often, but every web designer is going to be a little bit different. So I would advise you to use the class selector, which would include that little period, so dot header instead of the £sign header, right? But the main thing I wanted to emphasize at this point is that this main div class container is holding all of these guys, all of them. And I refer to that main div .main as grandfather. And so here we can see there's our grid that we're going to be working with. And I've actually given this container a slight tone so I can see it. So that's our grandfather div. By the way, this width right here is 1024. So if I make this div visible and select it, 1024 by 1024, okay, is the width of that .main class. Following that, I'm going to start adding nested divs to the grandfather div. So I'm going to make these guys visible really quickly. So here is the header. The green box is the banner. The blue box is for content. And the yellow box is the footer. Corresponding to the PDF that I've given you, header, right, is that red box. Banner is that green box. Content is the blue box. Footer is the yellow box. You'll notice I've skipped a few of these divs, and the reason being is because those guys are actually on a separate, I guess, sort of tier. Maybe that's the right word to use. But they are children of these fathers. So there's the grandfather, the main grandfather div, then there are the fathers, right? And then following that, there are the children divs. So these two divs are actually nested within that father div, which is called header. The banner div does not have any children divs. It exists on its own. That's fine. We could add something, or if you want to add something, you can. But in this particular circumstance, I am not going to be adding any nested divs within the banner div. The content div has two nested divs, one that is floating left and one that is floating right. 1, 2. If we go back, look at, here's the content div, which is blue. And content right and content left are purple and this tan. Oops, accidentally moved that. Those guys are nested within that larger father div. Moving on, same principle. We have a footer div, and within the footer div are two nested divs. One is for a secondary menu, and the other is for social media. If we go back to our PDF, there's the footer div, which is yellow. And then we have a social media div floating left, and a second, and whoops, I mixed those two up. The social media is actually floating right, and the secondary menu should be floating left, in my opinion. But that's a design decision, so it's completely up to you. This is all, semantics. You can, in all honesty, you can arrange things how you choose, but this is a strong suggestion. And I'll tell you why. We're not reinventing the wheel here. We're trying to focus on a predictable and intuitive user experience for folks. And a main menu is always in the top left-hand corner, and a main logo, getting my words mixed up today. A main logo is always up in the top left-hand corner, and a user expects to be able to click on that and go to the home page of a website, period. There's no arguing that. Usually, there is a main menu in the top right-hand corner of a website, and folks are just used to going there and finding a page like contact, about, or whatever pages might be necessary for that specific website. But the main menu is always in the top right-hand corner. Typically, there is some kind of visual imagery or a banner, and then there is an opportunity for content. And then on the bottom, there is a footer with social media icons, and a secondary menu. Sometimes a secondary menu can actually be right below here. So, sometimes folks actually put a menu right here below the primary header. It just kind of depends. You sort of figure out what your user is doing and what they expect, and There's no exact science to it, but there are some basics to sort of follow. So there's my sketch. The other thing I want to mention is pixel dimensions are so important. That's why we want to use grid paper or Adobe Illustrator or something so that we can really keep track of all this business very closely. Looks like I'm kind of moving around my div boxes a little bit. Save that. So if I select my header div at the very top, I can see the dimensions. It's 1024 wide by 128 tall. And let's go back. I'm going to reiterate these dimensions: 124 wide by 128 tall. The logo div is 96 tall. And right now it's 272 wide. Actually, I might change that. Let's go. It could be anything, honestly, because you have flexibility here. But you know, my intuition is telling me that I would have a simple square like that in the corner, and it would be 96 by 96. But when you fit this div to be snug within the header div, you have to account for this extra room, this extra margin or padding around. So I'm going to show you. Let's use this kind of pink so that we can see. Duplicate that so that we have margin at the top is 16. The margin at the bottom is 16. And the div itself is 96 tall. You add all that together, and it's 128 tall. The header div is 128 tall, the height. If you happen to create a div that is taller than this div, you might run into issues, because how is this guy going to fit? How is this div or that height going to be accommodated by that father div? It won't work. So this guy may not render, and you may break your website. So that's why it is very important to be mindful of margin, padding, the actual div dimensions, width and height, and how everything adds up so that everything is snug as a bug within this quote unquote div puzzle. All right. Math is very crucial. Even if it's 1 pixel off, sometimes you can break your website. Just keep the math thing very close to your thoughts, because yeah, I mean, you can cause yourself a lot of unnecessary frustration by not doing your math correctly. So please use grid paper, map it out very carefully before you even start coding. Add your father divs first. I mean, before that, you know, add your grandfather .main class div. Then add your father divs. Then following that, add your children divs. The nested, you are already familiar with this process, because when we were talking about ordered and unordered lists, we were also talking about nesting those within each other. And it's the same principle, except instead of a list, it's a div. That's it. So it's just a total semantical syntax thing. But you guys are already familiar with this process. Now you just have to make it work. The other thing that I want to mention is that notice how within this header, one div is on the left-hand side, one div is on the right-hand side. If you look in your layout notes, you're going to see a section that's all about float and layout. Sorry about that, guys. I had a knock on the door. So yeah, float this div left with your CSS and float that div right with your CSS. Similarly, float this div left, float this div right, float this div left, float this div right. Now let's take a look at an example. This particular example was done by a former student of mine. And you can see he created a project folder. He has an index file. He should have just called this one just regular index, not the dash v8. It's okay. I mean, it's not the end of the world. But he also has his styles, CSS. So everything looks to be in good order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open, there's his HTML file. And look how simple this is. This is all you need on the HTML side of things. Of course, there's his link to his style sheet. There is his grandfather div. There is the header div, which is the father, right? Or one of the fathers. Here is the banner div, which is one of the fathers. Here's the content div, which is one of the fathers. So here's the opening and the closing. And then lastly, here is the last father div called footer. And then within those father divs are children divs. Here is logo. Here is menu. Within the content div, C_left, C_right. Within the footer div, secondary, and then social media. And Cristiano took it a step further and he added social media divs, so little boxes for social media icons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so yeah, that would be, I guess, a grandchild div. Now let's take a look at the styles. I think I had mentioned earlier, instead of using a class, Cristiano opted to use the ID selector method. So there's that pound sign. So pound main, right? And there's the margin 0, which is going to center that main grandfather div. And then he's given it a background color. And he's given it a width of 1024. And this was a smart thing that he did. Instead of giving it a specific height, he said the height should be 100%. Very, very smart. And now he is starting to specify padding as well. I'm not sure if you need padding or margin on the grandfather div, but he did do that. Now, he adds his header. This is one of the father divs that he's styling. And he's given it a margin. This is very, very important, actually. This is a very important point, so focus on these words. You cannot see a div or a box until you give it a background color and a width and a height. Otherwise, you'll be wondering why you don't see anything. It's there, but you can't see it visually until you either A, add content to that div, so for example, text, or until you give it a background color and a specific width and height. And so you can kind of see Cristiano has styled each of these divs uniquely to fit his vision. Although the truth is, the vision that we all have for this project is going to be remarkably similar, because we're all going to have a logo, we're all going to have a menu, we're all going to have a header portion of the document, a banner, a content portion, and a footer. We're not reinventing the wheel here. We're just putting the pieces together and learning how to technically resolve the div puzzle. Last thing I want to show you guys is the website actually rendered. Open with Firefox, and there it is. There's the grandfather div. There's the header div. There's the logo div. There's the menu div. Then over here, this is a banner div. And the content with content left and content right. and the footer div with a secondary menu and social media, and then these additional divs that he decided to add that would be opportunities or real estate for social media icons. That's it. So let's see, the other thing, I do want to show you another important aspect. So we're going to go back to the code really quickly. But remember I was talking about float left and float right for those children divs. So looking for social media, he's floating that guy right, float right. And the secondary menu is floating left. Now, if we go back to the code, you'll see that the order that you add these divs is very important too. So here's the father footer div, but because the secondary menu is by default pretty much going to come first, it's almost automatically going to float left, but it's not a bad idea to add that command anyway via CSS. So the secondary menu comes first and the social media menu comes second. The secondary menu comes first and the social media div comes second. So I think that's enough information for you guys to do this project. But remember, you need to break through this wall confidently so that you can continue on to web design too. Good luck, folks. And then I'll see you in office hours if you have any questions.